On July 27, 2020, the Advisory Neighborhood Commission of Chevy Chase, District of Columbia, met to vote on a resolution. The subject was a fountain. Not the fountain itself. The carved stone and the water and the landscaping would stay. What the commission wanted removed was a name, the brass plaque bearing that name, the tablet projection carved with that name. The inscription on the upper face of the memorial that read, in letters cut into stone, Newlands Memorial Fountain. The vote was unanimous. 6 commissioners, 0 opposition. 2 weeks after George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, nobody was willing to defend the honor of Francis Griffith Newlands. The fountain sits in Chevy Chase Circle at the border between Maryland and the District of Columbia. It's federal property, managed by the National Park Service. Erected by Congress in 1938 to honor a senator's achievements in irrigation. Behind the stone walls that line the circle stands the mansion that was the first house built in Chevy Chase. 9 Chevy Chase Circle, 14,000 square feet of Tudor Revival architecture on 2 acres of land. The house has hosted 20 United States presidents. Its builder's name is being systematically erased from public memory. Francis Newlands built America's first planned suburb. He also wrote covenants ensuring it could never be sold to black people, Jewish people, or immigrants. He created the Bureau of Reclamation and helped establish the National Park Service. He also spent 2 decades in Congress trying to repeal the 15th Amendment so that black men could not vote. He left behind 2 mansion monuments to his vision, one in Nevada, one at the gateway to Chevy Chase. Both are still standing. Beautifully maintained, worth millions of dollars. But the memorials bearing his name are coming down. To understand why a fountain needs a new name and a company had to disavow its founder, you have to go back to 1846, to Natchez, Mississippi, where a Scottish doctor's son was born into the last years before the Civil War and learned that power was something you could inherit and use to decide who belonged in America and who did not. Chapter 1. The Scottish Doctor's Son. Francis Griffith Newlands was born on August 28, 1846, in Natchez, Mississippi, during the final years before the country tore itself apart over the question of who counted as human. His parents were James and Jessie Newlands, immigrants from Scotland who had settled in the cotton country of the Deep South. James Newlands had been trained as a physician at Edinburgh, one of the great medical schools of the empire. He practiced medicine in Natchez, treating the planters and their families, navigating the social hierarchies of a city built on slavery. Francis was the 4th of 5 children. He would remember almost nothing of his father. James Newlands died in 1851, when Francis was 5 years old. Jessie Newlands was left with 5 children and whatever savings a Scottish doctor had managed to accumulate in Mississippi. The family did not stay. They moved first to Missouri, then to Quincy, Illinois, following relatives and opportunities north. By the time Francis was old enough to understand what was happening, the country was at war. He spent the Civil War years in Illinois and Washington, D.C., watching the capital city transform into the headquarters of the Union war effort. He was a teenager during Reconstruction, old enough to absorb the arguments about what the South would become, about whether freed slaves would be citizens, about whether the federal government could force states to treat black people as equals. The politics of Mississippi, of the antebellum South, of the lost cause, of white supremacy as an organizing principle, stayed with him. He would carry those beliefs north and west, across decades and thousands of miles, into the United States Senate. The family settled in Washington, D.C., where Jessie Newlands raised her children on what remained of her late husband's estate. Francis was privately tutored, then enrolled at Yale College in 1867 at age 21. He lasted 1 year. Yale was expensive, and Francis had 4 siblings and a widowed mother. He returned to Washington and enrolled at Columbian College Law School, which occupied a 46-acre campus on the hill where Meridian Hill Park now sits. The school would later become George Washington University. Francis graduated in 1869 at age 23 and was admitted to the District of Columbia Bar the same year. He had a law degree and no money and no prospects. Washington in 1869 was crowded with young men in exactly his position, ambitious, educated, looking for a way up. Francis made a calculation. The East was full. The West was empty. Opportunity was west. In 1870, he borrowed money from a classmate named James Allen and bought a train ticket to San Francisco. He was 24 years old, carrying a law degree and the political education of a Southern Democrat who had watched the North win the war and impose its will on the states. He would never live in the South again, but the South lived in him. San Francisco in 1870 was a city remade by gold and silver. The 49ers had arrived 2 decades earlier, and the Comstock lode in Nevada was pouring wealth into the Bay Area at a rate that made the original gold rush look modest. Fortunes were being made and lost in mining stocks, in railroad schemes, in real estate speculation. The city had banks and hotels and mansions, and a class of nouveau riche industrialists who needed lawyers to manage their empires. Francis started at the bottom. He took court-appointed criminal cases, defending men who could not afford to pay him. But he was good. He was quick and precise, and understood how to make a legal argument. Within 3 years, by 1873, he had attracted the attention of the businessmen who ran San Francisco. He transitioned from criminal law to corporate law, from defending petty criminals to representing mining companies and banks. He was 27 years old and successfully established in one of the richest cities in America. What he needed next was not skill. He had skill. What he needed was capital and connections. In 1874, he found both. Chapter 2. Marrying into Silver. On November 19, 1874, Francis Griffith Newlands married Clara Adelaide Sharon in San Francisco. The San Francisco Chronicle devoted a full page to the wedding, not because Francis was particularly notable, but because Clara was the daughter of William Sharon, and William Sharon was one of the richest men in the American West. The wedding took place at the Sharon residence. Clara was the only daughter of a mining magnate who had made his fortune on the Comstock lode, the massive deposit of silver ore discovered in Nevada in 1859. Newspapers reported that Clara came with a dowry of $1 million. Whether the figure was accurate or not, the message was clear. Francis Newlands, the 28-year-old lawyer who had arrived in San Francisco 4 years earlier with borrowed money, had married into serious wealth. William Sharon had arrived in California during the gold rush and spent the 1850s dealing in real estate in San Francisco. He was shrewd and patient and understood that the real money was not in mining but in financing miners. In 1864, he moved to Virginia City, Nevada, as the manager of the Bank of California's branch office. The bank loaned money to mining operations. When the miners could not repay the loans, the bank foreclosed. Sharon accumulated mines, mills, and monopoly control over how ore moved through the Comstock region. If you wanted your silver processed, you used Sharon's mill. If you refused, your ore sat unmilled and worthless. By the 1870s, Sharon was earning more than $100,000 per month, roughly $3 million in today's currency, from mining operations he had acquired by foreclosure. He was not a kind man. He was ruthless in the way that men who build empires from nothing tend to be ruthless. In 1875, his business partner William Chapman Ralston's financial empire collapsed. Ralston drowned in San Francisco Bay the same day, either by accident or suicide. Sharon acquired most of Ralston's assets, including the Palace Hotel in San Francisco and Ralston Hall in Belmont, California. Some of Sharon's contemporaries believed he had engineered Ralston's collapse. Others said he had simply been the main beneficiary of his partner's mistakes. Either way, Sharon ended up with the properties. Francis married into this fortune and immediately went to work managing it. He helped Sharon reopen the Bank of California after a brief closure. He supervised operations at the Palace Hotel, a massive 7-story structure that was the most luxurious hotel west of Chicago. Francis and Clara moved into the Palace Hotel and lived there for several years. The hotel was elegant, but it was not a home. They had 3 daughters, Edith Maria, Janet, and Frances Clara, and Clara eventually convinced Francis that children should not be raised in a hotel, no matter how grand. They moved to a house shortly before Clara became pregnant with their 4th child. On February 8, 1882, Clara died in childbirth. The baby, a son, was stillborn. Francis was 35 years old, a widower with 3 young daughters, and then he inherited everything. Clara had been William Sharon's only daughter. Her death made Francis the trustee of her portion of the Sharon estate. The inheritance made him a millionaire. He now controlled property, mining interests, hotel operations, and investment portfolios that generated enormous income. He was no longer a lawyer working for a wealthy father-in-law. He was the manager of one of the West's great fortunes. William Sharon died on November the 13th, 1885. He had spent his final years embroiled in a bizarre legal battle with a woman named Sarah Althea Hill, a mentally unstable former mistress who claimed Sharon had secretly married her and that she was entitled to his estate. The case dragged through the courts for years. Hill produced a marriage contract that many believed was forged. Eventually, the courts ruled against her, but the scandal damaged Sharon's reputation and complicated the disposition of his estate. Francis Newlands, as trustee, had to protect the estate from Hill's claims and manage the complex web of properties and investments Sharon had accumulated. The legal strategy required that Francis and the other Sharon heirs establish residency in Nevada, where federal courts would have jurisdiction and where the estate could be better protected. In 1888, Francis moved to Reno, Nevada. He was 42 years old, recently remarried, and tasked with managing an empire. His second wife was Edith Hall McAllister, whom he had met in England during a business trip. They married on September 4, 1888, in Hesketh with Beckinsale, Lancashire. Edith was 14 years younger than Francis. They moved to Nevada together, and Edith gave birth to 2 sons in the 1890s. Both boys died in infancy. Francis and Edith would have no surviving children together, but Francis's 3 daughters from his first marriage accompanied them to Nevada. Nevada in the 1880s was not an obvious place for a man of Francis's ambitions. The state was small, with a population of just over 60,000 people. The Comstock lode that had made Sharon wealthy was declining. Reno was a railroad town, dusty and remote, nothing like San Francisco, but Nevada offered political opportunity. The state had only 2 senators and 1 representative in Congress. A man with money and connections could build influence quickly. Francis set about doing exactly that. He used Sharon's money to invest in Nevada properties. He built a mansion on a bluff overlooking the Truckee River. He began developing residential neighborhoods in Reno. He cultivated relationships with Nevada's political establishment. And he started thinking about Washington, D.C., where he had grown up and where his legal career had begun. Sharon's fortune had given Francis wealth. Nevada gave him a political base. What he needed next was a project, something large enough to establish him as more than just a trustee of someone else's estate. He needed to build something of his own. In the late 1880s, Francis began looking at land in the District of Columbia. Sharon had invested in Washington real estate years earlier, buying parcels in what would become DuPont Circle when the land was still undeveloped. Those investments had appreciated enormously. Francis sold some of the DuPont Circle properties for 10 times what Sharon had paid for them. The profit was over $1.5 million. Francis took that money and looked northwest, beyond the settled boundaries of Washington, where farmland was cheap and the federal government was planning to extend Connecticut Avenue into Maryland. He saw open land and a streetcar line that did not yet exist and a suburb that no one had imagined. He saw an empire he could build from nothing, and he saw an opportunity to design, from the beginning, exactly who would be allowed to live there. Chapter 3. Building the Empire. In the late 1880s, Francis Newlands formed a partnership with Senator William M. Stewart of Nevada. Stewart was one of the most powerful Republicans in the Senate, a lawyer who had made a fortune representing mining interests and a political operator who understood how federal power could be leveraged for private gain. Stewart had served as Nevada's senator from 1864 to 1875, and again from 1887 to 1905. He was famous for having drafted the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. Years later, he would work alongside Francis Newlands to develop a suburb designed to exclude black people from living there. Neither man saw any contradiction. Their target was the undeveloped land northwest of Washington, D.C. In what would become Chevy Chase, the area was farmland, fields and forest, a few scattered houses, nothing approaching suburban development, but it had potential. Connecticut Avenue was being extended north from the city. The federal government was investing in infrastructure, land was cheap, and Stewart had connections in Congress that could be useful for securing the necessary permits and franchises. Newlands and Stewart used a strategy common among land speculators. They employed straw purchasers. Instead of buying land in their own names, which would have driven up prices once sellers realized who was buying, they had agents quietly acquire parcels on their behalf. Between 1886 and 1890, these agents accumulated land in northwestern Washington and southern Montgomery County, Maryland. The acquisitions were kept secret as long as possible. On June 23, 1888, Newlands secured a charter for the Rock Creek Railway. The charter authorized construction of a single-track electric streetcar line that would run from Florida Avenue in Washington north to the District Line and beyond into Maryland. Electric streetcars were new technology. Most cities still used horse-drawn cars. An electric line represented modernity and speed, and crucially, it would make the remote farmland accessible to people who worked in the city. By June 6, 1890, the straw purchasers had assembled 1,712 acres. On that date, Newlands and Stewart incorporated the Chevy Chase Land Company, bringing all the parcels under unified ownership. The Washington Star newspaper called it, quote, one. The paper was not exaggerating. No one had attempted a development of this scale in the Washington area. The funding came almost entirely from the Sharon estate. Francis was trustee. He had discretion over how the estate's money was invested. He spent Sharon's money liberally, justifying the expenditures as sound long-term investments that would benefit the Sharon heirs. The Rock Creek Railway alone consumed more than $1.5 million, an enormous sum in 1890. The trolley had to be built before the suburb could be marketed. Roads had to be constructed. Bridges had to be erected. Infrastructure had to be created where none existed. Between 1890 and 1892, the Chevy Chase Land Company executed a remarkable construction program. The company built 2 bridges, including a critical span across Rock Creek at Calvert Street that opened the entire northwest quadrant of Washington to development. It constructed 5 miles of road along Connecticut Avenue. It laid streetcar tracks. It built a hydroelectric power plant to generate electricity for the streetcar line. It created an artificial lake, Chevy Chase Lake, to drive the generator. It installed water mains and sewer lines. It strung electrical and telephone wires. The company was not just subdividing farmland. It was building a complete suburb from scratch with every modern convenience available. Newlands understood that infrastructure was not enough. The suburb needed an identity, a vision that would attract the right kind of buyer. He hired civil engineers, sanitary engineers, structural engineers, architects, and landscape architects. The company imposed architectural design guidelines and zoning restrictions. Every house had to meet certain standards. Lots were large, streets were wide and tree-lined. The Society for Architectural Historians would later write that, quote, too. In 1892, Francis Newlands entered politics. Nevada's population had grown, and the state's mining interests were aligned with the Silver Party, a populist movement that advocated for bimetallism and greater federal support for Western development. Newlands ran for Nevada's single House seat as a Silver Party candidate. He crushed his Republican opponent, William Woodburn. The campaign was less about Newlands' personal appeal than about Nevada's economic interests. Silver miners wanted the federal government to buy silver and coin it into currency. Gold Standard Republicans opposed this. Newlands supported it. He won easily. In March of 1893, Francis Newlands took his seat in the United States House of Representatives. He was 46 years old, the trustee of a mining fortune, the developer of a streetcar suburb, and now a congressman from Nevada. He would serve in the House for 10 years, then in the Senate for 14 more, dying in office in December of 1917. Over those 24 years, he would pass legislation that created the Bureau of Reclamation and helped establish the National Park Service. He would also spend those years trying to repeal the 15th Amendment and advocating for the United States to remain a white man's country. But first, he had to finish building Chevy Chase. The infrastructure was in place. The streetcar line was operating. The roads were paved. Now he had to design the community itself and decide who would be allowed to live there. Chapter 4. The first planned suburb Chevy Chase was marketed as a quote 3, a place where families could own spacious houses on large lots, with modern conveniences, tree-lined streets, and proximity to Washington without the noise and crowding of the city. The promotional materials emphasized stability, comfort, and class. What they did not say explicitly, but what was understood by everyone involved, was that Chevy Chase would be for white people only. The Chevy Chase Land Company did not write racial restrictions directly into the property deeds. Doing so would have been legally questionable, and Francis Newlands was too careful a lawyer to create documents that could be challenged in court. Instead, the company used economic barriers. The covenants attached to each lot required that any house built on the property must cost at least a certain amount, $3,000 on some lots, $5,000 on others. These were enormous sums in the 1890s. The lower amount was more than most working families earned in 5 years. The higher amount could buy a small commercial building. The effect was precise. Black families, Jewish families, and immigrant families who had systematically been denied access to wealth through employment discrimination, bank redlining, and wage suppression could not afford to build houses that cost thousands of dollars. The covenants ensured that only wealthy white families could buy land in Chevy Chase. Technically, the restriction was economic. Practically, it was racial, and it was entirely legal. But the economic covenants were only part of the exclusion. The Chevy Chase Land Company also imposed explicit prohibitions on who could use community facilities: black people, Jewish people. And immigrants were forbidden from riding the Rock Creek Railway streetcars. They were banned from Chevy Chase Lake, the artificial lake the company had created to power the generator. Starting in 1894, the company opened an amusement park at the lake, with boating, swimming, a carousel, and picnic grounds. The amusement park was explicitly for white patrons only. Signs at the entrance made this clear. The park operated until 1936, serving as both a recreational facility and a marketing tool to attract prospective buyers to the development. The company provided free grocery delivery via the streetcar line to residents. If you lived in Chevy Chase, your purchases from Washington shops could be sent north on the trolley at no charge, but only white residents received this service. The infrastructure of convenience was itself segregated. Newlands also oversaw the development of community institutions designed to reinforce the suburb's exclusive character. He founded the Chevy Chase Club and served as its first president. The club offered golf, tennis, and social events. Membership was restricted to wealthy white families. Newlands built the Chevy Chase Springs Hotel, which later became the Chevy Chase School for Girls and eventually the 4-H Youth Conference Center. He arranged for churches and schools to be constructed. Every institution was designed to serve the white families the company wanted to attract. The architectural guidelines enforced by the company ensured visual coherence. Houses had to be set back from the street. No commercial buildings were permitted in the residential areas. No row houses or multifamily dwellings were allowed. The result was a landscape of substantial single-family homes on large lots, with broad verandas, patterned shingles, decorative cornices, and a variety of architectural styles: Queen Anne, Colonial Revival, Tudor, that gave the suburb a refined, established appearance, even though it was brand new. By 1900, about 50 families had moved to Chevy Chase. The community quickly gained a reputation for pure drinking water, wide streets, shady trees, an excellent library and school, efficient electric railway service, and scenic Chevy Chase Lake. It was, by all accounts, a success. The Washington Star praised the development as a model for how suburbs should be built. Architectural journals highlighted the planning and infrastructure. The Chevy Chase Land Company became a case study in suburban development. Newlands replicated the model elsewhere. In 1893, he began subdividing property he had inherited through the Sharon Estate in Burlingame, California, south of San Francisco. He started with the Burlingame Country Club and 5 cottages. In 1894, he added a train station. The same economic covenants that governed Chevy Chase governed Burlingame. The same exclusions applied. The same wealthy white families were the target market. What Newlands had created was a template. Other developers studied Chevy Chase and copied its methods. The use of minimum construction costs to exclude minorities without explicitly mentioning race became standard practice in suburban development across the country. When the Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934, it adopted similar guidelines, explicitly recommending that developers use economic restrictions to maintain neighborhood homogeneity. The FHA's underwriting manual warned that properties would lose value if, like Alsra, quote 4 moved in. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was identical to Newlands' intent in 1890. Keep black people out. Chevy Chase was not the first suburb in America, but it was the first major suburb built according to comprehensive planning principles and designed from inception to exclude non-white residents through methods that would survive legal challenge. It was a blueprint for segregation that would be used for decades. Newlands himself was quite open about his vision. In speeches and writings, he described Chevy Chase as a place for the better class of people. He meant white people with money. He was not subtle about this. He did not need to be. In the 1890s and early 1900s, white supremacy was the dominant ideology in both major political parties. Woodrow Wilson, elected president in 1912, segregated the federal workforce. The Supreme Court upheld racial covenants in housing. Newlands was operating in an environment where his views were not controversial. They were mainstream. But Newlands went further than most. He did not simply accept segregation as a fact of American life. He actively worked to expand it, to institutionalize it, to make it permanent through law and infrastructure and architectural design. Chevy Chase was his laboratory. What he learned there, he would try to apply to the entire country. First, though, he needed headquarters. 2 of them, one in Nevada, his political base, one in Chevy Chase, the gateway to his creation. Both would be mansions. Both would still be standing more than a century later. Chapter 5. 2 mansions. The Chevy Chase Land Company did not write racial restrictions directly into the property deeds. Doing so would have been legally questionable, and Francis Newlands was too careful a lawyer to create documents that could be challenged in court. Instead, the company used economic barriers. The covenants attached to each lot required that any house built on the property must cost at least a certain amount, $3,000 on some lots, $5,000 on others. These were enormous sums in the 1890s. The lower amount was more than most working families earned in 5 years. The higher amount could buy a small commercial building. Newlands wanted to see everything. He wanted a clear view in every direction of the land he would shape. The house was designed as an observation post from which he could survey the Truckee River Valley and the Nevada desert beyond. The vista would inspire his politics. When he looked out from Rattlesnake Point, he saw arid land that could be irrigated, desert that could be turned into farmland, a landscape waiting for federal intervention. The view shaped his vision for Western reclamation. Construction was completed in 1890. Newlands moved in with his second wife, Edith, and his 3 daughters from his first marriage. The house became the center of a growing residential development. Newlands subdivided the land around his mansion, creating neighborhoods east, south, and west of his property. The area would eventually become the Newlands Historic District, listed on the National Register of Historic Places for its architecture, landscape design, and association with the City Beautiful movement in urban planning. The Reno mansion was Newlands' Nevada base. It was where he lived when managing the Sharon estate properties. It was where he entertained Nevada politicians and businessmen. It was his command center for the Western Empire he was building. But Newlands also needed a presence in Washington. In 1893, after his election to Congress, he commissioned construction of a second mansion at 9 Chevy Chase Circle. The location was critical. Chevy Chase Circle was the gateway to the suburb, the first thing visitors saw when arriving by streetcar. Newlands wanted a house that would serve as a model for what he envisioned as the typical Chevy Chase home, opulent and ample. The architect was Leon Dessez, a Chevy Chase architect who would design several prominent homes in the development. The style was Tudor Revival, a fashionable choice in the 1890s that evoked English country estates. The house sat on 2 acres bordering the District of Columbia and Maryland line. The exterior featured smooth stucco, dark-stained wood trim, and uncoursed stone. A stone porte-cochere sheltered the entrance. The design was originally more subdued than it would later become. But even in its initial form, the house was substantial and impressive. Newlands named the estate Ishpeming, a Chippewa word meaning, quote, six, quote. The name was both literal. The property sat at the highest point in Chevy Chase, and symbolic. Newlands saw himself as occupying the high ground morally, politically, and socially. He believed he was building a community that represented the best of American values. That those values included explicit racial exclusion did not trouble him. The Chevy Chase Circle mansion served multiple purposes. It was Newlands' residence when Congress was in session. It was the headquarters of the Chevy Chase Land Company. It was a showplace that prospective buyers could tour to see what quality of house could be built in the suburb. And it was a statement. The house announced that Chevy Chase was a place for people of wealth and taste, and that not just anyone could buy land there. Newlands divided his time between Reno and Chevy Chase, between his two mansions and his two empires. In Nevada, he was the trustee of the Sharon fortune and a developer of residential neighborhoods. In Washington, he was a congressman who served on the Ways and Means Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee. He was organizing the Chevy Chase Club and serving as its first president. He was a man who moved between worlds with ease. In 1898, the Chevy Chase Circle mansion attracted the attention of federal officials who inquired whether it might serve as the vice president's residence. The United States did not yet have an official residence for the vice president. That would not come until 1974, with the designation of Number 1 Observatory Circle. The Newlands mansion was large enough and grand enough and appropriately located, but the idea was not pursued. Instead, the house remained Newlands' private residence. In 1903, Newlands was elected to the United States Senate. He decided he needed a residence more conveniently located to Capitol Hill. He purchased an estate called Woodley, situated off Connecticut Avenue in what is now Woodley Park within the District of Columbia. Woodley had a long history. It had been built in 1792 and had served as the summer home of several presidents and cabinet members. Newlands moved there and used Woodley as his primary Washington residence. The Woodley estate now serves as the centerpiece of the Merit School. With Newlands no longer living at 9 Chevy Chase Circle, the Chevy Chase Land Company needed to sell the property. In 1909, the house was sold to William S. Corby for $35,000. Corby was a Washington businessman whose family had founded the Corby Baking Company in 1891. William and his brother Charles had built one of the largest bakery enterprises in the region, eventually employing more than 450 people and plants in Washington, Alexandria, and Richmond. The brothers' success had come from inventing a revolutionary machine that could mold dough into loaves much faster than a human baker could. They leased the patented machine to bakeries across the country and made a fortune. Corby was exactly the kind of buyer Newlands had envisioned for Chevy Chase: wealthy, successful, white, and eager to establish himself among Washington's elite. Corby was not satisfied with the house as Newlands had built it. Between 1911 and 1914, Corby hired Arthur Heaton to oversee a massive renovation and expansion. Heaton was the architect of Washington National Cathedral, one of the most important architects working in Washington. Under Heaton's direction, the house was transformed. A grand ballroom was added with 30-foot ceilings, walls lined with paintings, a 3-story bay window with stained glass, an Aeolian pipe organ, and an orchestra pit. A mahogany library was constructed. A music room was added with organ pipes visible throughout. The house expanded to 22 rooms and approximately 14,000 square feet. It became a venue for entertaining on a scale that matched Washington's most important social gatherings. The Corby Mansion, as it came to be known, would host 20 United States presidents, countless members of Congress, foreign dignitaries, and the most prominent families in America. The house had transformed from Newlands' model home into something far grander, but it still served the purpose Newlands had intended. It was a monument to wealth and exclusivity. It stood at the gateway to a suburb designed to exclude, and it would outlast every attempt to remove the builder's name from public memory. In Reno, the Newlands mansion continued to serve as his Nevada base. It remained in the family until Newlands' death in 1917. It was then purchased by George Thatcher, a Reno attorney who added a library wing in 1923. Thatcher was a prominent divorce lawyer. Nevada had become famous for quick divorces, and celebrities and socialites came to Reno to establish residency and dissolve their marriages. Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, stayed at the Newlands mansion in 1935 while waiting for her divorce to be finalized. In 1942, the house was purchased by Dr. Sidney King Morrison, a physician who had established his practice in Reno in 1902. Morrison and his wife Janet lived in the house until Janet's death in 1972. During those years, the Morrisons maintained the property carefully, preserving its original features. In 1963, the Newlands Mansion in Reno was designated a National Historic Landmark, one of only 6 properties in Nevada to receive that recognition. The designation cited Newlands' prominence in politics, water and reclamation projects in the West, in Adrienne and the architectural significance of the house. The plaque mentioned nothing about his racism. In 1984, the house was purchased from the National Trust for Historic Preservation by Dan and Melinda Guston, who undertook a complete restoration. They removed later additions to reveal the original redwood siding and cedar shingles. They restored the interior features, including the original cast-iron radiators, doors, floors, and hardware. The house today is a private residence, fully restored and maintained according to National Historic Landmark standards. Both mansions, 9 Chevy Chase Circle and the Reno House on Elm Court, still stand. Both are privately owned. Both are worth millions of dollars. Both have been lovingly maintained and carefully restored, and both serve as monuments to a man whose political career was dedicated to ensuring that people who were not white could never live in neighborhoods like the ones he created. Chapter 6. The Senator's Vision. Francis Newlands spent 10 years in the United States House of Representatives, from March 4, 1893 to March 3, 1903. He served on the Committee on Foreign Relations and the Committee on Ways and Means. He was a critic of Republican financial policy, a champion of free silver and bimetallism, and a consistent advocate for greater federal involvement in Western development. He was also, from his first day in Congress, an advocate for restricting the rights of Black Americans and limiting immigration to white people only. The two positions were not in conflict in Newlands' mind. He believed the federal government should be powerful and active, but only in service of white Americans. He wanted federal funding for irrigation projects that would benefit white farmers. He wanted federal protection for forests and parks that white families could enjoy. He wanted federal regulation of railroads and corporations that employed white workers. But he did not want Black Americans to vote or immigrate or live in his suburb. He spent 24 years in Congress trying to make his vision law. In 1898, Newlands introduced a joint resolution to annex the Republic of Hawaii. The resolution passed, and Hawaii became a United States territory. The annexation was driven by sugar plantation interests and strategic military considerations. It also represented Newlands' expansionist vision. The United States should control the Pacific, should project power across the ocean, should become an empire. The fact that annexation ended native Hawaiian sovereignty and imposed American law on a population that had not consented to it did not trouble him. Empire required taking land from people who had it and giving it to people who did not. But Newlands' primary focus was on the arid West. He had seen the potential in Nevada, desert land that could be irrigated, made fertile, transformed into farmland. The technology existed. Dams could be built. Canals could be dug. Water could be diverted from rivers to fields. What was missing was federal funding and federal coordination. Individual farmers and private companies could not afford the massive infrastructure projects required. The federal government would have to do it. Newlands introduced legislation repeatedly. He argued that the federal government should sell public lands in the West and use the proceeds to fund irrigation projects. The projects would create, quote, 7, his last name became a pun, out of desert. Settlers would move west, establish farms, build towns, create wealth. The West would be transformed from empty space to productive territory, and the people who settled there would be, Newlands believed, white. In 1902, Congress passed the Newlands Reclamation Act. the legislation created the United States Reclamation Service, which later became the Bureau of Reclamation. The law authorized the federal government to construct dams, reservoirs, and irrigation systems in 16 western states. The projects would be funded by revenue from the sale of public lands. Farmers would repay the cost of the irrigation systems over time, and that money would be used to fund additional projects. It was a self-sustaining program designed to transform the West. The Reclamation Act was Newlands' greatest legislative achievement. Over the next century, the Bureau of Reclamation would build some of the largest dams in the world: Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, and create irrigation systems that made agriculture possible across millions of acres. Phoenix and Las Vegas grew into major cities because federal dams provided water. The agricultural industry of California, Idaho, and Washington existed because of federal irrigation projects. Newlands had created a system that reshaped the West. But the projects came with costs that Newlands did not acknowledge and that Congress did not seriously consider. Native American tribes were displaced. Ecosystems were destroyed. Rivers that had flowed for millennia were dammed and diverted. Fish populations collapsed. Canyons were flooded. The Truckee-Carson Irrigation Project in Nevada, one of the first built under the Reclamation Act, diverted water from Pyramid Lake, which was central to the Paiute people's culture and economy. The lake's water level dropped, fish populations died, and the Paiutes' traditional way of life was undermined. The Haksini quote Usteris. Newlands created were not empty. They were taken. In 1903, Newlands was elected to the United States Senate. He served from March 4, 1903, until his death on December 24, 1917. He was re-elected in 1908 and 1914. He chaired the Committee on Corporations organized in the District of Columbia, the Committee on Revolutionary Claims, and, most significantly, the Committee on Interstate Commerce. The Interstate Commerce Committee had jurisdiction over railroads, which were the primary means of moving goods and people across the country. During World War I, the committee became critical to the war effort, coordinating the transportation of troops and supplies. Newlands worked on these issues until the day he died. He also continued his conservation work. In 1905, he supported legislation to protect national forests under the United States Forest Service. In 1916, he supported the creation of the National Park Service, which would centralize management of the country's parks and monuments. In 1917, Congress enacted his proposals for a National Waterways Commission to coordinate federal investment in rivers and harbors. These were significant achievements. They established frameworks for federal conservation policy that are still in use today. In 1912, Newlands served on the Senate subcommittee investigating the sinking of the RMS Titanic. He attended the first 10 days of hearings and focused particularly on the inadequate number of lifeboats aboard the ship. The investigation led to reforms in maritime safety regulations. It was considered one of the most important Senate investigations of the 20th century. Newlands also supported the creation of the Federal Trade Commission in 1914 and authored the Newlands Act of 1913, which provided for mediation and conciliation in labor disputes. He supported women's suffrage. He believed in expert commissions and administrative boards to manage complex policy issues. He wanted tariff policy set by experts rather than politicians. He advocated for national incorporation of railroads, an idea that railroad executives eventually adopted. By any measure, Newlands was a productive legislator. He passed major laws. He shaped federal policy in conservation, reclamation, labor relations, and commerce. He was re-elected multiple times. He chaired important committees, he was respected by colleagues in both parties, and he spent those same years advocating for the removal of black people from the United States. Chapter 7. The White Man's Country. On the floor of the United States Senate, Francis Newlands was explicit about what he wanted. He wanted the 15th Amendment repealed. He wanted black men to lose the right to vote. He wanted immigration restricted to white people only. He wanted the United States to remain, in his words, a white man's country. He was born in Natchez, Mississippi in 1846, in the final years before the Civil War. His father died when he was 5. His family moved north, but the politics of the antebellum South stayed with him. Reconstruction had been a mistake, in his view. Giving black men the vote had been a disaster. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, was an error that needed to be corrected. Newlands said this publicly, repeatedly, throughout his 24 years in Congress. He introduced bills, he gave speeches, he wrote articles in academic journals. He was not subtle, he did not use coded language. He called black people a race of children who threatened the United States. He proposed that the federal government pay to deport black Americans to the Caribbean or Africa. He argued that Asian immigrants would take over the West Coast and had to be excluded. He advocated for a white plank in the Democratic Party platform that would restrict immigration to Europeans only. In 1909, Newlands published an article in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science titled "A Western View of the Race Question." The article was presented as a serious policy proposal. Newlands argued that the race problem in America could only be solved by removing black people from the country. He proposed that the federal government establish a fund to pay for the transportation of black Americans to Africa or to Caribbean islands. He claimed this would be humane because it would allow black people to live in societies where they would not compete with white people. The article used pseudoscientific racism that was common in academic circles at the time. Newlands cited social Darwinism, eugenics, and theories of racial hierarchy that claimed white people were naturally superior. He wrote that black people were inherently incapable of self-governance and that giving them political rights had been a mistake. He argued that the 15th Amendment should be repealed and voting rights returned to the states, which would allow Southern states to disenfranchise black voters legally. Newlands introduced legislation to implement his proposals. None of it passed, but the fact that he introduced it at all and that he served on major committees and was re-elected multiple times shows that his views were not disqualifying in early 20th century America. White supremacy was mainstream. Woodrow Wilson, elected president in 1912, segregated the federal workforce. The Supreme Court upheld racial covenants in housing and approved laws that restricted black voting rights. Newlands was not an outlier. He was operating within a political system that shared his assumptions. But Newlands went further than most of his colleagues. Many senators accepted segregation as a fact of life. Newlands wanted to make it permanent through constitutional amendment. Many congressmen supported restricting immigration from Asia. Newlands wanted to restrict immigration to whites only and deport black Americans who were already citizens. Many politicians used racist rhetoric. Newlands wrote academic articles proposing systematic racial removal. He was also more explicit than most about how his conservation and reclamation work connected to his racial ideology. The western lands he wanted to irrigate were not empty. Native American tribes lived there. The dams and reservoirs he wanted to build would flood their lands and destroy their fishing grounds. Newlands did not care. His vision for the West was a vision of white settlement. The new lands he wanted to create were for white farmers. The parks he wanted to protect were for white recreation. Federal power, in his view, should serve white people. The irony of his partnership with William M. Stewart was noted even at the time. Stewart had drafted the 15th Amendment. He believed black men should have the right to vote. Newlands believed the opposite. The two men worked together to develop Chevy Chase. They shared ownership of the Rock Creek Railway. They coordinated their land purchases, but they disagreed fundamentally about black humanity. Neither man saw this as a reason to end the partnership. Business was business. Newlands also supported women's suffrage, which creates an additional layer of contradiction. He believed white women should vote. He believed black men should not. He supported expanding political rights along gender lines while contracting them along racial lines. This was not ignorance. This was choice. Newlands understood equality as a principle. He simply believed it should apply only within the white race. The congressional record preserved every speech he gave. The academic journals archived every article he wrote. The newspapers printed his interviews. There is no ambiguity about his views. He wanted black people removed from America. He wanted Asian immigrants excluded. He wanted the United States to be, explicitly and permanently, a nation for white people only. In 1916, Newlands was the only Democratic senator to vote against Louis Brandeis's nomination to the Supreme Court. Brandeis would be the first Jewish justice. Newlands opposed him. His vote was consistent with his ideology. Jews, in his view, were not part of the vision for America he was trying to build. By 1917, Newlands was 71 years old and in failing health. He had served in Congress for 24 years. He had passed the Reclamation Act. He had helped create the National Park Service. He had shaped federal policy on conservation, labor relations, and interstate commerce. He had also spent those years trying to repeal black voting rights and advocating for racial deportation. He never apologized. He never moderated his views. He never acknowledged that his positions were wrong. He believed, until the day he died, that he was right. He believed America would remain a white man's country. He believed the fountain that would be built in his honor would stand forever. He was wrong about that. Chapter 8, December 24th and the Bronze Memorial. On the afternoon of December 24th, 1917. Francis Newlands was working at his Senate office when he suffered a heart attack. He was 71 years old and had been working at an unsustainable pace for weeks. The United States had entered World War I in April, and the Interstate Commerce Committee, which Newlands chaired, was critical to the war effort. Railroads had to be coordinated to move troops and supplies. Transportation bottlenecks had to be resolved. The logistics of mobilizing an industrial economy for war required constant attention. Newlands had ignored warnings about his health. He kept working. On Christmas Eve, his heart stopped. Staff rushed him home to 2236 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest. He died at 10:15 that night. His wife, Edith, and her brother were with him. The timing was noted in every obituary. The senator had died on Christmas Eve, still in service to his country, working until the end. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the story. The Washington Post described his death as casting, quote, 17, quote, the Nevada. Papers praised his decades of service to the state. The obituaries focused on his legislative achievements, the Reclamation Act, the support for conservation, the work on wartime transportation. Some mentioned his role in developing Chevy Chase. None mentioned his white supremacist ideology or his efforts to repeal the 15th Amendment. The racism was simply omitted. Funeral arrangements were delayed while the family waited for word from Newlands' daughters. Edith and Johnston lived in Santa Barbara, California. Mrs. William B. Johnston lived in Boston. Both were Newlands' daughters from his first marriage to Clara Sharon. They had to travel across the country to attend their father's funeral. The service was held in Washington, and Newlands was interred at Oak Hill Cemetery, a prestigious burial ground in Georgetown where senators, cabinet members, and other prominent figures were laid to rest. In 1918, the Senate held a memorial service. Colleagues gave speeches praising Newlands' work. The eulogies were collected and published by the government printing office in 1920 in a volume titled De Quote 18. The book runs 182 pages. It praises his conservation work, his support for irrigation, his role in creating the National Park Service, and his service during World War I. The word Chase, quote 19, does not appear. His advocacy for repealing the 15th Amendment is not mentioned. The memorial volume presents a sanitized legacy. This sanitization was not unique to Newlands. It was standard practice. When powerful men died, their accomplishments were celebrated and their failures were forgotten. The racism that had been explicit during their lives became invisible in death. Future generations would read the memorial volumes and the historical markers and assume that these men had been heroes without complication. Newlands' estate was substantial. He had managed the Sharon fortune for more than 3 decades. He owned property in Nevada, California, and Washington. He had shares in the Chevy Chase Land Company, the Rock Creek Railway, and various mining operations. His widow, Edith McAllister Newlands, inherited considerable wealth. She would live until the 1930s, managing the estate and maintaining her husband's legacy. In 1932, 15 years after Newlands' death, Congress authorized the construction of a memorial fountain in Chevy Chase Circle. The bill specified that the fountain would honor Newlands' achievements in irrigation and reclamation. It would be a federal monument built on land managed by the National Park Service, partially in the District of Columbia and partially in Maryland. The location was deliberate. Chevy Chase Circle was the gateway to the suburb Newlands had created. The fountain would stand at the entrance to his greatest achievement. Edith McAllister Newlands provided the funds for the fountain's construction. The design was classical, a circular stone structure with water features and landscaping. A brass plaque was installed bearing Newlands' name. A tablet projection was added with his full name, Francis Griffith Newlands. The inscription carved into the upper face of the memorial read, quote, 20, quote, the monument was intended to last forever. The dedication ceremony was held in 1938, 21 years after Newlands' death. Speeches were given by members of Congress and officials from the Interior Department. The fountain was praised as a fitting tribute to a man who had transformed the West through federal reclamation projects. No one mentioned that Newlands had also designed Chevy Chase to exclude black people, or that he had spent decades trying to strip black Americans of the right to vote. The fountain honored only the acceptable parts of his legacy. In 1943, during World War II, a Liberty ship was commissioned and named the Francis G. Newlands. Liberty ships were mass-produced cargo vessels, built quickly and cheaply to replace ships lost to German submarines. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war. Most were named after prominent Americans, presidents, senators, writers, and reformers. The Francis G. Newlands served throughout the war, carrying supplies across the Atlantic. In 1965, after 22 years of service, the ship was scrapped. The honor was temporary, but the fountain remained. Through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the memorial stood at Chevy Chase Circle. Tens of thousands of cars drove past it every day. Residents of Chevy Chase saw it regularly. It was maintained by the National Park Service. Flowers were planted around it. The water ran. The brass plaque gleamed. And no one questioned whether Francis Newlands deserved to be honored. The silence was not accidental. It was structural. The people who lived in Chevy Chase were the beneficiaries of the suburb Newlands had created. Their homes had appreciated in value because of the exclusivity he had designed into the community. Their property values depended on maintaining that exclusivity. Questioning Newlands' legacy would require questioning the foundations of their own wealth. It was easier not to ask. The same was true in Reno. The Newlands Mansion was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1963. The plaque emphasized his Chires, quote, 21 mod. A park in Reno was named Newlands Park. The historic district surrounding his mansion was called the Newlands Historic District. The Truckee-Carson Irrigation Project, one of the first built under the Reclamation Act, was officially named the Newlands Project. His name was everywhere. No one mentioned the racism because the racism had been effective. Chevy Chase remained predominantly white. The economic barriers he had built were still working. The wealth accumulated by white families in the suburb was generational. Houses bought in the 1930s and 40s for thousands of dollars were worth hundreds of thousands by the 1980s, and millions by the 2000s. The segregation Newlands had designed was self-perpetuating. His vision had been realized. And then the internet arrived. Archives were digitized. The congressional record was put online. Academic journals were scanned. Newspaper articles from the early 1900s became searchable. Anyone with a computer could find Newlands' speeches. Anyone could read his 1909 article proposing racial deportation. Anyone could see that the fountain at Chevy Chase Circle honored a man who had explicitly, repeatedly, publicly advocated for white supremacy. In 2014, someone looked. Chapter 9. The Long Silence and First Cracks. For 76 years, from 1938 to 2014, the Newlands Memorial Fountain stood unchallenged. The brass plaque was polished. The water ran. The National Park Service maintained the landscaping. And nobody questioned whether Francis Griffith Newlands deserved to have his name carved in stone. During those decades, both of Newlands' mansions thrived. The Chevy Chase Circle house changed hands in the 1940s. The Corby daughters inherited it when William Corby died. They maintained it as a private residence, continuing to host social events and political gatherings. The house remained one of the most prestigious addresses in the Washington area in the mid-1970s. The Corby daughters left the property to the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral Foundation of the District of Columbia. In 1976, the foundation sold the house to private owners for $335,900. The new owners continued the tradition of using the house for high-level entertaining. The ballroom that Arthur Heaton had designed in 1911, with its 30-foot ceilings and Aeolian pipe organ, hosted diplomats and politicians and corporate executives. The house was called the Corby Mansion now, not the Newlands Mansion. The builder's name had been forgotten. In Reno, the Newlands Mansion on Elm Court followed a different path. George Thatcher, the divorce lawyer who bought the house in 1920, lived there until 1942. He had added a library wing in 1923, a large room with oak flooring and walnut paneling that became one of the most beautiful spaces in the house. Thatcher's specialty was Nevada divorces. The state had liberal divorce laws, and celebrities came to Reno to establish residency and end their marriages. Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, stayed at the Newlands Mansion in 1935 while waiting for her divorce paperwork to be finalized. The house became associated with Reno's divorce industry, but it was always maintained with care. In 1942, Dr. Sidney King Morrison purchased the house. Morrison was a physician who had established his practice in Reno in 1902, the same year Newlands passed the Reclamation Act. He had served as chief medical examiner for Nevada during World War I. His wife, Janet Bell Morrison, was a former teacher who became deeply involved in Reno's civic life, particularly in education and the Trinity Episcopal Church. The Morrisons raised their family in the house and maintained it lovingly. When Sidney died in 1942, Janet continued living there until her own death in 1972. For 3 decades, the house was the Morrison family home. In 1963, the house was designated a National Historic Landmark. The designation recognized Newlands' prominence in politics, water and reclamation projects in the West, and as the developer of Chevy Chase, Maryland. The plaque acknowledged the architectural significance of the Queen Anne structure and its association with Western development. The designation said nothing about Newlands' racism. That part of his legacy was not considered relevant to the house's historical importance. In 1984, Dan and Melinda Guston purchased the house from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They undertook a comprehensive restoration. Later additions were removed to reveal the original redwood siding and cedar shingles. Interior features, the cast iron radiators, the original doors, the oak floors, the hardware, were preserved or restored. The house became a showpiece of historic preservation, maintained according to National Historic Landmark standards. The Gustons understood they were stewards of an important piece of Nevada history. Meanwhile, the Chevy Chase Land Company continued to operate. The company still managed commercial real estate in Montgomery County, Maryland. By the 2000s, its portfolio included more than 1.5 million square feet of office space, retail properties, and mixed-use developments. The company remained privately held. In 2008, David Smith became president and CEO. Smith was Francis Newlands' great-great-grandson. The family was still benefiting from the empire Newlands had built more than a century earlier, but cracks were beginning to show. Urban historians studying housing segregation in America were examining how suburbs were designed in the early 20th century. Chevy Chase appeared repeatedly in the research. The economic covenants Newlands had used became a case study in how discrimination could be legally structured. Academic papers documented the connection between Chevy Chase's design and the later policies of the Federal Housing Administration, which had replicated Newlands' methods on a national scale. Environmental historians were also reassessing the legacy of Western reclamation. The dams built under the Reclamation Act had transformed the West, but they had also destroyed ecosystems and displaced Native American tribes. The Truckee-Carson Irrigation Project, officially called the Newlands Project, had devastated Pyramid Lake and undermined the Paiute people's traditional way of life. Scholars began asking whose interests reclamation had served and who had paid the price. The answers were uncomfortable. Reclamation had benefited white farmers in white cities. Native peoples and the environment had suffered. The Internet accelerated this reassessment. The congressional record was digitized and made searchable. Anyone could find Newlands' speeches advocating for the repeal of the 15th Amendment. His 1909 article, Quote 23, was scanned and uploaded to academic databases. The full text was available to anyone who searched for it. Newlands' own words documented his ideology. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. He had been explicit about what he believed. In 2014, a member of the Advisory Neighborhood Commission in Chevy Chase proposed a resolution calling for the removal of Newlands' name from the fountain. The resolution cited his white supremacist views and his advocacy for repealing the 15th Amendment. It argued that honoring such a man in a public space was inappropriate and that the fountain should be renamed. The proposal sparked debate in the community. Some residents said they had never known about Newlands' racism. Others admitted they had known, but had not considered it relevant to the fountain, which honored his conservation work. Opposition to the resolution came primarily from people who argued that removing the name would belittle Newlands' legislative accomplishments, and that it was wrong to judge historical figures by contemporary standards. The phrase "man of his time" was used repeatedly. The resolution failed, but the conversation had started. Local newspapers covered the debate. Historians weighed in. The Chevy Chase Historical Society struggled with how to present Newlands' legacy. The phrase, quote, 27, quote, emerged as a way to acknowledge his racism without fully condemning him. But as more people read his actual words, the idea that his legacy was merely, quote, 28 became harder to sustain. Similar conversations began in Reno. Native American activists pointed out that Newlands Park and the Newlands Historic District honored a man whose reclamation projects had devastated their communities. They called for renaming. Some residents resisted, arguing that Newlands had, quote, 29, quote, and, quote, 30, quote. But the activists countered that those achievements had come at native expense, and that honoring Newlands meant celebrating the displacement of indigenous peoples. In August 2014, David Smith was abruptly removed as president and CEO of the Chevy Chase Land Company. The company declined to say why. The timing was notable. Smith's ouster came just months after the first public controversy over the fountain. Whether his removal was connected to his family relationship with Newlands is unknown. But the company was clearly trying to distance itself from its founder. Between 2015 and 2019, awareness of Newlands' racism grew slowly but steadily. Articles appeared in the Washington Post and local Maryland newspapers. Montgomery County historians gave talks about the suburb's origins. The National Park Service, which managed the fountain, maintained a neutral position. As a federal agency, it could not act without congressional authorization. If Congress wanted the name removed, the Park Service would comply. But the Park Service would not initiate the removal itself. By January 2020, the status quo seemed stable. The fountain still bore Newlands' name. The mansions still stood as private residences. The Chevy Chase Land Company still operated under that name. Newlands Park in Reno was still called Newlands Park. The debate had not been resolved, but it had not escalated either. Then, on May 25, 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. The video of his death circulated worldwide. Protests erupted in every major American city. Confederate monuments were toppled. Statues of slave owners and segregationists were removed by protesters or by city governments trying to avoid confrontation. The conversation about who deserved to be honored in public spaces became unavoidable. In June 2020, the Chevy Chase Land Company released a statement. The company's board of directors had met and decided they could no longer remain silent. The statement read, "The Chevy Chase Land Company of today stands for the ideals of diversity and inclusion. To truly move forward, we must acknowledge our past and come together to build an inclusive community. Our board of directors recognizes that despite Senator Newlands' accomplishments, his views on race contradict the ideals of our company fabric." The company announced it would support efforts to rename the Newlands Memorial Fountain. It was a remarkable admission. The company founded by Francis Newlands was disavowing its founder. The statement stopped short of renaming the company itself, but it signaled that the era of silence was over. On July 27, 2020, the Advisory Neighborhood Commission of Chevy Chase, District of Columbia, voted on a resolution to remove Newlands' name from the fountain. The vote was unanimous. 6 years after the first attempt, there was no opposition. The climate had changed completely. George Floyd's murder had made it impossible to defend honoring a white supremacist, no matter what else he had accomplished. The resolution asked the National Park Service to remove the brass plaque, the tablet projection, and the carved inscription. It also called for the creation of an interpretive exhibit documenting Newlands' racism and explaining why his name had been removed. The resolution passed, but it was symbolic. Only Congress could actually authorize the removal. The commissioners sent the resolution to Eleanor Holmes Norton, the District of Columbia's non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives, and to Maryland's congressional delegation. The reckoning was no longer theoretical, it was happening. Chapter 10. Dustbins of History. On August 4, 2020, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton and Congressman Jamie Raskin introduced legislation to remove Francis Newlands' name from Chevy Chase Circle. The bill was straightforward. It directed the Secretary of the Interior to remove the brass plaque bearing Newlands' name, to remove the tablet projection carved with his name, and to remove the inscription, quote, 32, quote, from the upper face of the memorial. The removed items would be offered to Newlands' descendants or added to the Rock Creek Park Museum collection. New interpretive signage would be installed to provide historical context. Norton's statement was unequivocal, quote 33. Then she added the line that would define the debate, quote 34. Raskin's statement was equally direct. Francis Newlands was a segregationist and white supremacist, and the time is long overdue to retire his name and the plaque honoring him at Chevy Chase Circle. Newlands worked to institutionalize his beliefs in white supremacy and did what he could to increase the racism that continues to plague our country and our people. Newlands called for the repeal of the 15th Amendment, which invalidated race discrimination in voting rights, advocated racist and anti-immigrant policies, and backed efforts to deprive African Americans, Jews, and other minorities of basic human rights. The bill received attention but did not advance immediately. Congress was dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic collapse, and the aftermath of the presidential election. A small piece of legislation about a fountain in suburban Maryland was not a priority. On January 18, 2022, Senators Ben Cardin and Chris Van Hollen introduced companion legislation in the Senate. Both Maryland senators co-sponsored the bill. Cardin's statement acknowledged complexity while rejecting honor. Quote, 36, quote. Van Hollen emphasized the ongoing impact. Quote 37. Quote, in January 2022, the House Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands held a hearing on the bill. Norton testified. She brought copies of Newlands' speeches from the congressional record. She read excerpts from his 1909 article. She documented the housing covenants used in Chevy Chase. The hearing record became a comprehensive documentation of Newlands' ideology. Opposition to the bill was minimal. A few witnesses argued that removal would set a dangerous precedent, that it was impossible to find historical figures without flaws, that we should not judge the past by present standards. But no one could defend Newlands' specific statements. His own words were too explicit. The bill did not advance to a vote. Congress moved on to other priorities. The fountain remained unchanged. On July 22, 2025, 5 years after the first bill was introduced, Norton and Raskin reintroduced the legislation. They were joined by Van Hollen and Senator Angela Alsobrooks, Maryland's newly elected senator. The reintroduction generated new attention. By 2025, hundreds of Confederate monuments had been removed across the country. The debate about who deserved public honor had been largely settled. Defending monuments to white supremacists was no longer a tenable political position, but the fountain still stood. As of January 2026, Newlands' name remained carved in stone. Federal legislation moved slowly. The National Park Service waited for congressional authorization. The memorial that Edith McAllister Newlands had funded in 1938, intended to honor her husband forever, was under sustained attack. But it had not yet fallen. Meanwhile, the Chevy Chase Land Company took a more decisive step. In 2025, the company officially renamed itself. It became 656. The full name, Chevy Chase Land Company, was retired. The company's website, business cards, and signage were changed. Press releases used only the initials. The rebranding was explicitly presented as a move toward, quote, 38, quote, and away from the founder's legacy. Critics noted the irony. The company was distancing itself from Newlands' name while continuing to profit from the properties he had developed, the infrastructure he had built, and the exclusive character he had designed into Chevy Chase. The wealth generated by his vision continued to flow to the company's shareholders. Changing the name was symbolic. It did not change who benefited from his work. In Reno, similar debates continued. Newlands Park remained Newlands Park, though the Reno City Council discussed renaming. The Newlands Historic District was still called that, though some residents proposed alternative names. The Newlands Project, the official name of the Truckee-Carson Irrigation Project, was still in use by the Bureau of Reclamation, though Native American tribes and environmental groups called for it to be renamed. In each case, the argument was the same. Newlands' conservation and reclamation work should not be honored because it was inseparable from his racism and his displacement of Native peoples. The Newlands Mansion in Reno remained a National Historic Landmark. The designation had not been revoked. The plaque still emphasized his role in reclamation and Western development, but the interpretive materials had been updated. Visitors were now told about his white supremacist ideology and his efforts to repeal the 15th Amendment. The National Historic Landmark designation remained, but the narrative had changed. In March 2020, the Chevy Chase Circle mansion sold for $10 million. The buyer was Adrienne Arsht, a Washington philanthropist and arts patron. Arsht is best known for her donation to the Performing Arts Center in Miami that bears her name, the Adrienne Arsht Center for the Performing Arts. She purchased the mansion as a private residence. For the first time in years, the buyer's identity was made public. Previous owners had been intensely private. Arsht was more visible. The house continues to be used for high-level events, but it is not open to the public. Both mansions, in other words, remain exactly what they were built to be, private residences for wealthy, powerful people. The Chevy Chase Circle house is worth tens of millions of dollars. The Reno house, as a National Historic Landmark and private residence, is similarly valuable. The physical structures have outlasted every controversy. They have outlasted their builder's reputation. They are beautiful, carefully maintained, architecturally significant, and completely disconnected from the ideology that inspired their construction. This disconnection is, in some ways, the most striking part of the story. The houses stand as proof that architecture can survive the moral collapse of the architect. Buildings are not responsible for the beliefs of the people who built them. A Tudor Revival mansion is still beautiful, even if it was designed as a monument to exclusion. A Queen Anne house with 87 windows is still architecturally significant, even if those windows were meant to survey an empire of segregation. But the disconnection also raises questions. Can we preserve the buildings while condemning the builder? Should we? The National Park Service thinks so. The houses are protected because of their architectural merit, not because of who built them. The Chevy Chase Historical Society agrees. The mansions are part of the community's history, and history is complicated. What is not complicated is the memorial. The fountain at Chevy Chase Circle was built for one purpose: to honor Francis Newlands. It tells no story. It provides no context. It simply declares that a man named Newlands deserves to be memorialized. In 2025, that declaration is no longer acceptable. Eleanor Holmes Norton's phrase, quote, 39, captured what is happening. Newlands' name is being removed from public spaces. The company he founded has abandoned his name. Legislation is pending to remove his name from the fountain. Parks named for him are being reconsidered. The Newlands Project may be renamed. His legacy is being dismantled piece by piece. But the mansions remain. The Chevy Chase Land Company, now CCLC, still operates profitably. The suburb is still exclusive, still wealthy, still predominantly white. The economic barriers Newlands built are still functioning, adjusted for inflation but structurally identical. His vision was realized, and that vision has proven more durable than his honor. The reckoning is incomplete. Names are being removed. Plaques are coming down. But the wealth his developments generated is still circulating. The segregation patterns he established are still visible. The template he created for suburban exclusion is still in use across America. Putting his name in the dustbins of history is necessary, but it is not sufficient. The structures he built, physical, economic, and social, remain. Dismantling those will take more than removing a brass plaque. Francis Newlands built 2 mansions, and both are still standing. 9 Chevy Chase Circles sold for $10 million in 2020. The Reno Mansion is a National Historic Landmark, lovingly restored, worth millions. Both houses are occupied by wealthy families. Both are maintained with care. Both are monuments to architectural excellence. Newlands also built America's first planned suburb, designed from inception to exclude Black people, Jewish people, and immigrants. The suburb is still there. The houses he envisioned still line the streets. The trees he specified still shade the sidewalks. The infrastructure he installed still functions. Property values in Chevy Chase remain among the highest in the Washington metropolitan area. The exclusivity he designed has proven durable. What is collapsing is not the empire. It is the honor. The memorial fountain at Chevy Chase Circle is under sustained legislative attack. The Chevy Chase Land Company has renamed itself to distance from its founder. Newlands Park in Reno may be renamed. The Newlands Project is being reconsidered. His name is being systematically removed from public spaces. Eleanor Holmes Norton said he belongs in the dustbins of history. The process of putting him there is underway, but the dustbins are visible. We can still see what he built. The mansions are not hidden. The suburb is not demolished. The wealth his developments generated has not been redistributed. The segregation patterns he established have not been dismantled. His physical legacy outlasted his moral legacy by more than a century. The buildings he erected will outlast his reputation by considerably more. This is the paradox at the heart of architectural preservation. We can save the beautiful things terrible people built. We can protect the houses while condemning the builder. We can walk through Chevy Chase and admire the design without endorsing the designer. We can preserve the Reno Mansion as a National Historic Landmark while acknowledging that it was built with money made by foreclosing on minors and displacing native peoples. But preservation requires honesty. If we keep the houses, we have to tell the whole story. The brass plaque that said Newlands Memorial Fountain should be replaced with interpretive signage that explains who he was and what he believed. The National Historic Landmark designation for the Reno Mansion should include information about his white supremacist ideology. The Chevy Chase Historical Society should teach the full history of how the suburb was designed and who was excluded. The lesson is not that we should tear down the mansions. The lesson is that beautiful architecture can be built by people with ugly ideas, and that preserving the architecture does not require honoring the architect. Stone lasts longer than bronze. Buildings outlast reputations. Power built on injustice can create structures that endure long after the injustice is acknowledged and condemned. Francis Newlands believed he was building a permanent white homeland. He designed covenants that would last forever. He erected monuments that would never come down. He was wrong. The covenants are illegal now. The monuments are being dismantled. His name is being erased from public spaces, but the houses remain. And that might be the darkest part of the story. The empire he built works without his name on it. If this story resonated with you, consider that every suburb has a history. Every exclusive neighborhood was designed by someone, and the question of who was allowed to live where has always been a question of power. The structures we inherit, the houses, the streets, the property lines, carry the decisions of the people who built them. Some of those decisions were about beauty and function. Others were about who belonged and who did not. Recognizing the difference is how we decide which legacies to preserve and which to consign to the dustbins.